More men are choosing to stay single. Not because they can't find someone, not because they're afraid of commitment, but because they're no longer convinced that being in a relationship is worth the cost. And that's a shift nobody saw coming. Because for decades, we assumed men would do anything to lock down a partner. But what if the equation changed? What if men started doing the math differently? The old narrative says men are commitment phobes, emotionally unavailable, terrified of the ring, that they'll run at the first sign of intimacy. Hollywood sold us this story for decades, and there's some truth to it, but it's incomplete. Because what if the real story is different? What if men aren't running from relationships, they're running towards themselves? Here's what we know. Men benefit more from marriage than women do. Married men live longer, they're healthier, they earn more, they report higher life satisfaction. So statistically, a man should want marriage. But something shifted, and it's not what you think. A research study found that 64% of young men haven't been on a date in the past year. Compare that to women, and the numbers are similar. But here's the catch. Men aren't lonely because they want relationships but can't find them. They're not lonely at all, at least not the way we've defined it. The research shows male and female loneliness are nearly identical, 1% difference, almost statistically identical. So what's actually happening? Men aren't isolated because they're incapable of connection. They're isolated because they're making a choice. And understanding that choice requires looking at what changed. For most of human history, a man needed a woman to survive. That's not being romantic, that's being factual. A woman managed the household, she maintained social connections, she managed health and well-being. Without a partner, a man's life simply didn't work. He'd eat poorly, his clothes would fall apart, his emotional needs would go unmet. So marriage wasn't optional, it was necessary. But something fundamental changed, and it happened quietly. Men learned to cook, men learned to clean, men learned to manage their own health. And more importantly, men learned to meet their own emotional needs, not perfectly, but adequately enough that a woman is no longer necessary for survival. Simultaneously, everything else changed. Modern men can access anything they want: entertainment, community, sexual connection, companionship, often without the commitment of a relationship. You can game with people across the world. You can pursue hobbies solo. You can access therapy to process emotions. You can travel alone. You can build meaningful projects that give you purpose. None of this requires a romantic partner. Add to this awareness. Men are increasingly self-aware. They're thinking about what they actually want, instead of accepting what society tells them they should want. They're noticing patterns. They're reading psychology. They're in therapy. And that awareness is creating a very specific realization. Relationships are optional, not necessary. And if they're optional, then they need to be worth it. This is where the cost-benefit equation comes in, and this is where most people get it wrong. Because it's not that men don't want love. Men absolutely want love. What they're questioning is whether a specific woman in a specific relationship is worth the trade-off.
Let's be specific about the costs. A relationship requires emotional labor, and modern men are starting to recognize this as the actual cost, not as something they should ignore. When you're in a relationship, you're not just sharing space with another person, you're managing their emotions, you're proving yourself constantly, you're negotiating your autonomy, you're compromising your time, your space, your projects, you're investing energy into someone else's growth. And that's not bad, but it is real. It costs something. Modern men are also highly aware of risk. Divorce statistics haven't improved. Financial risk is real. Custody dynamics can be lopsided. Reputation risk exists. These aren't irrational fears. They're observable realities that a man can see around him. His friend went through a divorce. His brother lost half his assets. His coworker is trapped in an unhappy marriage because of legal and financial entanglement. And here's what's crucial. Men are thinking about this. They're not just accepting it as the price of being a man. They're asking, is this actually worth it?
Now, the benefits: companionship, sexual intimacy, shared growth, someone to talk to about your fears, someone who cares if you're struggling. These are real, meaningful benefits. But, and this is the key insight, these benefits require something that's increasingly rare: emotional alignment. A relationship only feels worth it if the other person is also aware, if she's doing her own psychological work, if she's not expecting you to be her emotional support system while she remains unconscious, if there's actual reciprocity instead of just obligation. Because here's what happens. A man meets a woman. She's attractive. There's chemistry. He falls in love. But then he realizes she doesn't do inner work. She's not self-aware. She has emotional needs that feel endless because they're not rooted in self-awareness. She expects him to fix her or complete her. She hasn't done the work to know who she is separate from a relationship. So the relationship becomes a job. He's maintaining her emotional world while trying to build his own. And he's thinking, I could be alone. I could pursue my own growth. I could be with someone who's actually done work on themselves. That's not rejection of relationships. That's a raised standard.
But there's another layer to this, and it's something we don't talk about enough. The more self-aware a man becomes, the harder relationships get. Because awareness reveals contradictions. When you're unconscious, you can accept whatever your partner does and rationalize it. She's just stressed. That's how women are. I'm the problem. But when you're aware, you see patterns. You notice when someone isn't growing. You recognize emotional manipulation, even if it's unintentional. You see when the dynamic is unequal. And that awareness makes it nearly impossible to stay comfortable in a relationship that isn't actually working. You can't unsee the truth. You can't go back to unconscious acceptance. So many men are in this position, too aware to accept a mediocre relationship, but holding themselves to a standard that barely exists. They want a partner who's also done inner work, who's emotionally mature, who brings peace instead of chaos, who's working toward growth. And these women exist, but they're rare, and competing for them requires being exceptional yourself. This creates a paradox. Self-awareness makes relationships harder to enter and harder to maintain, because a conscious man cannot be comfortable with an unconscious partner, and the market of conscious partners is small. So what happens? He waits, or he stays single, not because he doesn't want to love, but because the alternative, being in a relationship that requires him to manage someone else's unconsciousness, feels worse than solitude.
There's one more thing that often gets missed, and it's what might be the most important factor. Men are discovering that solitude isn't just the absence of relationship, it's the presence of something else: autonomy, purpose, creative energy, space to become who you actually are without compromise. A relationship requires constant negotiation. Your time isn't fully yours. Your space isn't fully yours. Your emotional energy isn't fully yours. You're always calibrating, always aware of another person's needs and moods. Even in a good relationship, you're not 100% free to be yourself. But alone, a man can be fully himself. He can work on his projects without interruption. He can pursue growth that's driven by his own values, not by what a partner expects. He can be weird and awkward and evolving without judgment. He can spend time on things that seem pointless to others but deeply matter to him. And here's what's counterintuitive. This isn't selfish. It's actually the opposite. A man who's free to become himself, who's not depleted by managing someone else's emotional world, who's not stuck in maintenance mode, that man is actually more capable of giving love when he does find it. But the incentive to find it has decreased because the cost of losing that freedom is enormous, and he's not convinced that any relationship can offer more than he already has. This is the real shift. Not that men hate relationships,
but that independence has become more appealing than interdependence. Solitude has become more peaceful than companionship, and the threshold for worth it has gotten very high. Here's what I want to be clear about. This isn't men rejecting love. This isn't men becoming more selfish or broken. This is men becoming more honest about the actual equation. For centuries, men had to accept whatever relationship came because the alternative was worse. Now the alternative isn't worse. It's actually pretty good. So the bar has gone up, rightfully so. Modern men aren't revving away. They're walking toward themselves. And if a woman wants to be part of that journey, she has to add more value than solitude does. She has to bring peace. She has to be doing her own work. She has to enhance rather than diminish. She has to be an addition, not a solution. That's not unreasonable. That's evolution. That's what happens when men stop being desperate and start being selective. The question isn't why men are staying single anymore. The question is, what would make a relationship feel worth choosing? And maybe that's the healthiest question a man can ask, because the answer determines everything. It determines whether he ever gets into a relationship, and more importantly, what kind of relationship he gets into. Because a man choosing based on value is a man who's either going to find something genuine or he's going to stay single. And either way, he's going to be okay. Thank you for watching. And don't forget, work on yourself, stay real, and stay aware.